Welcome everyone! Today we learn how to create an e-commerce application with Tailwind and Angular routing. So go to VS Code and create a new Angular application, open a new terminal and type ngn, define the project name. We will inline styles, skip test and select the defaults for simplicity. Execute the command, open the containing folder. So to build the e-commerce application, we'll install Tailwind, which is a CSS framework. So go to the official documentation. The first step is to create a project. The second step is to install Tailwind CSS. So copy the first command and run in a terminal. Execute the command. The second command is to generate this Tailwind configuration file. So go to terminal and execute the command. Go back to the documentation. And the third step is to configure the template path. So we'll copy this line and go to the Tailwind configuration and copy this line into the content array, save it, scroll down, and finally we'll add these directives in the styles.css file. So paste it, and we're ready to use Tailwind in this Angular project. So go to the official documentation and go to the components. Let's scroll down and search for e-commerce. So in the e-commerce section, we'll add a first component in the Angular application. So let's select this category previews. We will display this 3-column sample HTML. So copy the HTML, go back to VS Code and open a new terminal to generate a new component. So go to the app folder and type ngc to create a new component called category. Navigate to the HTML and paste the sample code. Now go to the routes configuration file in the Angular application to define the routes. So we have this routes array. When we define all the route configuration from the Angular application, so to add a new route, we need to define, or we need to specify the path. And the second property will be the component that we want to render when we navigate to this route, which will be category component. Save it and go to the main HTML file. Let's remove the sample code and let's keep the route outlet directive to dynamically load a component based on the current route. Let's save it and go to the first terminal and type ngs to set the application. Navigate to the application URL and go to the category route. And we have the template displayed from Tailwind CSS. Let's define this category route as a default. So go to VS Code and go to the routes configuration file. To define a default route, we need to add the path as empty and add a redirect to property specifying the route that we want to define as default. And the third property is this path match. Let's define this as full to validate the exact match between the URL and the configured path. So save it, go back to the Angular application, navigate to the default URL. You can see the category component is rendered. Now let's define a child route for this view to render a product list based on a category selected. So let's go to Tailwind CSS, go back to the e-commerce section. Let's click in this product list components. We'll use this second simple template to display this product list. Copy the HTML, go back to VS Code, and in the second terminal, we generate a new component called product list. So go to the product list HTML, paste the sample code, and go to the routes configuration to define the child route for this category component. So to define child routes, we need to add a new property called children. And this is an array which contains all the routes from this parent component. So similarly as we define the route with the path on the component, so the path will be the ID of the category and will render the product list component. So this is the child component that we want to render in the same view. So save it and go to the parent component, which is the category component. Go to the HTML and we want to render the product list when we click a category. So for the first category, we'll add a routing link directive to navigate to the child route. So open the TypeScript file and import the router link. in the info section, save it and go to the HTML. So for this first category, we'll replace this div as an A tag. Let me remove this href, and here in the A tag, we'll add the route link directive. We will hardcode the category. In this case will be 1 to that current route. Let's save it. Go back to the Angular application. When we click the first category, we will render the product list. So let's click, and it's not loaded yet because we need to add the route outlet directive at the bottom of the HTML to render the child component. So save it, and let's in the TypeScript file add the route outlet into the info section, save it. We have the root parameter, which is the category ID, and we render the product list. So navigate to the default route. It loads the category component, and when we click the category, the first category, we render the product list. So let's add some sample code to render the categories and the products from the code from the TypeScript file. So go back, and in the category component, I will copy sample categories with ID, the image, the title and description. Go to the HTML, and we'll use an ng4 directive. So add the common module, go to the HTML, remove the last two categories because we'll use the ng4 directive to iterate over the categories. Add this directive, and with iterate over the categories, replace each attribute. In this case, the image source will be item.image URL, and let's update the route link based on the selected category, which will be item.id, and transform this number as to string. Replace the title and the description, save it. Now go to the product list component and paste some products. Similarly, we'll import the common module to use the ng4 directive. Go to the product list HTML and replace the properties. Let me remove these products and add the ng4 directive based on the products. Replace the image source, the title and the price, and add the currency pipe to format the price. Save it and go back to the application. We'll render in the categories from the code, and similarly for the product list. So far so good. So when we click a particular category, the route is updated based on the category ID. We can also navigate to a particular route from code. So instead of using the route link from the category component, we'll inject the route service in the TypeScript file. So add a new property called route, and we'll use this inject to add the route service, and add a new function called display products based on a category ID, and call the navigate function from the route service to navigate to a relative path. So in this case, we'll define a string array to define the URL. So basically we'll pass just the category ID because we're using the relative path, and we want to specify the relative route. So to get the information about the current route, we need to inject the activated route service. So inject this service, and in a new object, in the second parameter of the navigate function, we'll define the relative to property on the current route. Let's save it, and in the HTML, remove this route link directive, and instead we'll add a click event from this category to call the display products function and pass the ID. Save it and go back to the application. As you will see, the URL is updated when we click a particular category. So far so good. Let's add a third component from Tailwind to display a product overview. So go back to the e-commerce section and select the product overviews. Let's copy this sample HTML code from these product overviews. Go back to VS Code and create a new component called product. Go to the HTML and paste the sample code. Go to the routes file to define a particular route for this component. Create a new route by defining the path, which in this case will be product, and a route parameter, which will be the ID of the product, and we'll render the product component. Let's move at the top and save it. Now go to the product list component HTML To navigate to the product component, we click any product from the list. So go to the HTML and add the routing link directive. So we'll define a relative path to navigate to the product overview component. So we need to define a string array. The first element of this array, we will navigate to the root path by going down to levels and define the product root. And the second parameter from this string array is to actually pass the ID of the product. So to use this route link directive, we need to import the import section, save it, and go back to the Angular application, click in any product, and you will see we navigate to the product overview and the root is updated based on the product ID. We can navigate to a particular route using an absolute path. So to define an absolute path, we use the slash notation and then define the root and pass the root parameter, which will be the product ID. Let's save it and test it. And we have the same behavior. Finally, we want to read the root parameters. We want to display dynamically this product list when we select a particular category. So for that, we will read the root parameter, the category ID, to display a particular product list. So go back to VS Code, go back to the children component to read the category ID root parameter. So for that, we'll inject the activated root service. This activated root service will get the information about the root. Let's save it, and in the ng-oninit method, we'll read the root parameter. So implement the oninit interface and add the method. Create a new constant called category ID. And there are two ways to read root parameters. The first one is to use a snapshot that we access the root ID parameter once when the component loads. So let's get the ID root parameter and we'll update the product images based on this category ID. So let's call products and add a for each statement, and we'll update the image URL based on the category ID. So add backticks to use interpolation. Let's copy this first image URL, and in the category page, we'll select the category page number based on the category ID and the image card based on the index of the for each statement. So in the for each, let's access the index, and the image card will be index +1. Let's save it. Go back to the Angular application, navigate to the default route and click in any category. The product list is displayed. We're rendering different products, but when we try to click at the second time, the root is updated, but we're not reading the root parameter because we're using a snapshot. We read the category ID root parameter once when the component loads, and we need to dynamically load the product list every time we select a category. So to achieve this, go back, and there's a second way to read root parameters. And when we need to read root parameters within the same component, we'll use the params observable to listen to any change in the root parameter. So let's comment this line and instead call router.params, which is an observable and subscribe when the root changes. We'll get the params and add the category ID constant, which will be the ID key from the params, and move this line into the subscribe. Let's save it, go back to the Angular application, and every time we click a particular category, you will see that we're rendering different products. So we're reading root parameters within the same view with the params observable. So in this demo, we've learned how to create an e-commerce application with Tailwind and Angular routing.